I have been asked to offer a brief history of the Saturn Theory. Of course, the phrase Saturn Theory means different things to different people, and thus it is necessary to distinguish between the different competing scenarios. Perhaps the one thing all of these historical reconstructions have in common is the idea that the planet Saturn played a pivotal role in recent Earth history in the development of human civilization. The catastrophist Saturn theory can be traced to Emanuel Velikovsky, who, in a short period of intense research in 1940, stumbled across the ideas that would eventually form the central plotline of Worlds in Collision, a runaway bestseller in 1950. Among his many novel claims was that Earth might have been a satellite of a sun-like Saturn during an early epoch in prehistory remembered as the Golden Age. Velikovsky had originally planned to include a section on his Saturn hypothesis in Worlds in Collision, but eventually thought better of it, reserving this discussion to a later time. Alas, that time never came. Velikovsky died in 1979 with the Saturn material still collecting dust in his study. It was subsequently published posthumously in a slipshod fashion in 2020 to a less than enthusiastic public. A golden opportunity, as it were, had been lost. Independently of Velikovsky, two distinguished historians of science, Giorgio di Santayana and Hertha von Deckend, published the notoriously eccentric and nearly inscrutable book called Hamlets Mill in 1969. These two were the first serious scholars to argue that the great heroes of myth are to be identified with the planets. In a passage that would serve as a rallying cry for this catastrophist, they wrote as follows, quote, "The real actors on the stage of the universe are very few, if their adventures are many. The most ancient treasure, in Aristotle's words, that was left to us by our predecessors of the high and far-off times was the idea that the gods are really stars and that there are no others. The forces reside in the starry heavens, and all the stories, characters, and adventures narrated by mythology concentrate on the active power among the stars, who are the planets." End of quote. A central thesis of Hamlet's Mill maintained that the planet Saturn played a surprisingly prominent role in ancient myth and religion. Among the author's numerous novel claims was that Saturn had some connection with the northern Poland region. Quote, "In China, Saturn has the title Genie du Pivot, as the god who presides over the center, the same title which is given the pole star. What has Saturn, the far-out planet, to do with the pole?" End of quote. Strict uniformitarians, di Santayana and von Deckend, sought to explain Saturn's role as god of the pole and measure of time by reference to an arcane hypothesis involving the precession of the equinoxes, the knowledge of which they argued extended back well into the Neolithic period. The collapse of the Golden Age and Saturn's fall from power, in their understanding, have nothing whatsoever to do with celestial catastrophe. Rather, such myths reflect a sophisticated understanding of the shifting of the equinoxes over time. Despite the immense erudition displayed, Hamlet's Mill represents a theoretical dead end, a last-ditch and ultimately futile effort to resurrect the pan-Babylonian hypothesis which held that cosmogonic myth was inspired by advanced astronomical knowledge during the prehistoric period. In reality, there is zero credible evidence for the sort of sophisticated astronomical knowledge assumed by di Santayana and von Deckend during the prehistoric period, or much prior to the Greek period for that matter. Velikovsky's most gifted and diligent defender during the 60s and 70s was the political scientist Alfred de Grazia, whose special series in American Behavioral Scientists in 1963 brought Velikovsky's ideas to a new generation of readers. This issue was later released as the book The Velikovsky Affair. Working in collaboration with the Canadian astronomer Earl Milton, de Grazia produced a major work entitled Solaria Binaria, which expanded on Velikovsky's ideas on Saturn. This book, little known today, is well deserving of revisiting as it previews many of the EU ideas later championed by Wal Thornhill. It also complements several of David Talbott's ideas on the evolution of the polar configuration. De Grazia and Milton proposed that Saturn and Earth were once participants in a barbell-like configuration where several large planets were positioned on either side of Saturn and Earth, thereby ostensibly supplying more stability to the polar configuration. Talbott discussed this problem in 1988 in Aeon. Quote, "More than one physical model, in order to preserve stability, or at least a semblance thereof, would suggest a lineup of planets in the fashion of a tumbling barbell, with the larger orbs balancing the two ends of the planetary assembly and the Earth locked in polar alignment between them. On this theoretical principle I can express no opinion, though applying the principle to the mythically supported planetary lineup does yield some interesting results." End of quote. Renewed interest in Velikovsky led David Talbott, in collaboration with his brother Stephen, to launch the journal Pensée. During this period, 1972 to 1975, Velikovsky shared some of his key ideas regarding Saturn with his personal research assistants Bill Mullen and Jan Sammer, who in turn shared them with others in the catastrophist community. It was the synopsis provided by Mullen to David Talbott in 1972 that inspired the latter to launch his own wide-ranging researches into ancient myth and archaeoastronomy, culminating in the Saturn Myth, published by Doubleday in 1980. If Hamlets Mill represents the most extensive discussion of Saturn mythology in conventional scholarship, the Saturn Myth represents the gold standard of Saturnist research from the catastrophist perspective. Briefly, Talbott claimed that the Earth had formerly moved in close proximity to Saturn while locked in axial alignment in a polar configuration of planets. It was the visual appearance and catastrophic behavior of Saturn and the other participating celestial bodies that gave rise to the central themes of myth and inspired the astral religions of the prehistoric world. Saturn's prominent placement in the center of heaven, for example, gave rise to the universal image of the so-called sun cross, a towering celestial apparition that inspired ideas of a world separated into four directions or watered by four rivers, among hundreds of similar mythological interpretations. Talbott would remain the driving force in the catastrophist community for the next 40 years, producing a number of books, articles, and public presentations. Among his many bold claims, Dave maintained that he had put forward a unified theory of ancient myth purporting to explain every major thematic pattern: Golden Age, Garden of Eden, First Man, Deluge, Dying God, War of the Gods, End of the World, etc. As originally formulated in the Saturn Myth, Talbott's theory rests upon a number of key postulates, the verification of which are crucial for a proper assessment of the hypothesis. First is the claim that Saturn was the ancient sun god represented by such familiar figures as the Egyptian Ra, Greek Helios, and Latin Sol. Second is the claim, borrowed from Hamlet's Mill, that Saturn formerly stood at the pole, specifically in the northern circumpolar heavens. Third is the claim that each of these propositions is universal in scope and owes nothing to diffusion. While this is not the place to offer a definitive appraisal of Talbott's Saturn theory, a few comments are in order, if only to summarize the current status of the debate and point the way forward. The idea that Saturn was a sun of some sort in antiquity is essential to Talbott's entire enterprise, and yet this claim is largely dependent on the evidence from ancient Mesopotamia, where the sun god Shamash is identified with Saturn in Babylonian astronomical texts circa 1300 BC. The evidence from later Greek and/or Latin texts, being both very late and likely deriving from Babylonian astronomy, is not really all that helpful. Indeed, if it could be shown that the Babylonian datum linking Saturn to the sun was diffused to ancient Greece or Egypt, this would seriously undermine Talbott's thesis. What is most needed at this point is for Saturn's identification with the sun to be confirmed in the astronomical texts of the Maya or some other ancient culture immune from the influence of Babylonian astronomy. Until that time, the evidential basis for the Saturn theory will remain tentative in nature and subject to alternative explanation. The Saturn theory was a recurring point of interest in the Velikovsky-inspired journal Chronos, published from 1975 to 1988. Velikovsky himself published several short articles on the subject, and these articles in turn inspired a bevy of researchers to launch investigations of their own into Saturn's role in ancient myth, including yours truly, Eduardo Cardona, Lynn Rose, Fred Juniman, Harold Tressman, and others. Velikovsky had argued that at some point in the last 10,000 years, Saturn had erupted in nova-like fashion, shedding an immense amount of light and flooding the Earth with salt water. It was this extraordinary catastrophe, according to Velikovsky, that gave rise to the festivals of light associated with the Saturnalia, Christmas, Hanukkah, and other analogous cultural practices. Such ideas would have a seminal influence on Eduardo Cardona, who produced 5 large volumes arguing that Saturn exploded as a nova at various geological junctures, leading to the wholesale extinction of large fauna on Earth and causing a myriad of genetic mutations. Never one to shy away from controversy, he went on to claim, quote, electrical discharges from our proto-Saturnian sun were not only responsible for the inception of life, they were also the prime movers behind evolution, end of quote. Although Cardona's understanding of ancient myth leaves much to be desired, at one point or another he identifies nearly every major god or goddess with Saturn. His various books are still of interest inasmuch as they point out a host of anomalies in the geological and paleontological record that are very difficult to square with the uniformitarian view. Cardona's books are also peppered with brilliant insights from Ralph Jurgens, Walt Thornhill, Anthony Perrott, Tom Van Flandern, Rens van der Sloot, and other heavyweights in the catastrophist movement. Taking a cue from Walt Thornhill, who, following Jurgens, had argued that the Saturn-Earth system had migrated into this solar system from somewhere outside Pluto, Cardona developed a grandiose theory in which Earth was born from Saturn and remained a satellite of the gas giant for millions of years in duration. After spending countless millennia in an Eden-like environment provided by Saturn's close proximity and beneficial radiation, wherein plant life flourished and human eyes became adapted to ultraviolet light, all came to an end with Saturn's removal. What are we to make of such ideas? So far as I know, Talbott himself has never endorsed Wall's proposal that the Saturn-Earth system somehow migrated from outside the solar system. Fascinating as it is to ponder, I have never found this hypothesis either plausible or supported by the historical record. To me, it seems more logical to assume that Saturn and the other planets participating in the polar configuration moved away with the final breakup, with the Earth remaining at roughly the same distance from the Sun as it occupies at present. As a trained biologist myself, I fail to see how it makes sense to view the wonderfully adapted life forms on Earth as recent immigres from some distant solar system where they evolved in the absence of the present Sun. Instinctual learning patterns evident in such familiar phenomena as bird migration would seem to require a long period of time on Earth in order to develop. No doubt it would be possible to conceive of hundreds of other common-sense-defying objections to the theory defended by Thornhill and Cardona, but I will leave this exercise to another time. In short, the Saturn theory remains very much a work in progress. A great deal of additional research, testing, and experimentation needs to be done before the hypothesis can be said to rest on a secure foundation. Among the most pressing issues are the following. 1. Finding a plausible physical mechanism capable of sustaining a polar configuration of planets. No small feat, as 45 years have come and gone since the publication of the Saturn Myth, with virtually no progress on this front. 2. Confirming Saturn's particular role in the polar configuration. And 3. Clarifying Saturn's role in cosmogonic myth, if any. In the meantime, there is much to celebrate in what has already been achieved. Talbott's masterful demonstration of the astronomical origins of the primary archetypes of ancient myth remains valid regardless of Saturn's ultimate role. The catastrophic model of ancient myth, likewise, is here to stay and represents one of the most significant developments of the 20th century. The future of comparative mythology, and in our view, the future of astronomy, plasma cosmology, and the EU model itself, we'll need to take such factors into account if Earthlings are ever going to achieve a unified theory of science worthy of the 21st century.